Have you ever walked into a room and known without a single shadow of doubt that something was watching you? Not someone, something that no matter how bright the lights were, no matter how many people were around, there was an intelligence rooted in that space, and it was older, colder, and hungrier than you could ever understand. I did, and I've been carrying that weight inside me for almost a year now. I don't talk about it. I don't like to. But some nights when I wake up soaked in sweat, when I hear that same soft knock from a wall that isn't there, I realize I have to tell someone, because silence has a cost. And what I saw, what I felt, doesn't stay quiet forever. My name is Caleb Price. I'm 36 years old, and I've served as a trauma chaplain for just under a year. I was ordained later in life, after losing my younger brother in a motorcycle accident. He died alone in a hospital corridor, waiting for someone to come comfort him. I swore then that no one should ever have to die like that again. That's why I'm here. That's why I took the job, to sit in the worst moments of people's lives and hold space when no one else can. This was supposed to be my first overnight shift at St. Luke's Medical Center. I had my notepad, my cross, my little worn copy of Psalms. The on-call pager buzzed at 9:13 p.m., and I walked into the trauma bay expecting blood, grief, maybe a few whispered prayers. What I got instead was him, and something standing behind him that should never have followed us in. Luke's is not like the gleaming medical towers you see on TV. It's an aging, hulking thing, built in 1924, with additions sloppily welded onto its bones over the decades. The ER is in the newer wing, sterile and cold, buzzing with the kind of mechanical whine that creeps into your skull. But the original trauma unit, that part's tucked deeper inside, where the walls are yellowed from age and hand sanitizer can't scrub out the scent of sorrow that lives in the grout. The hallways back there are narrow, dimly lit by flickering fluorescents, and they echo in strange ways. You hear things, shuffling, hushed voices that don't belong to anyone. I remember brushing past an old radiator pipe and feeling how icy it was, even though it was mid-July. One of the night nurses, Jasmine, caught me flinching and just said, "Yeah, that hallway's weird. Don't ask. Just don't stay in there too long." She said it like a joke, but her eyes didn't smile. Jasmine was one of the few people who stayed in that wing longer than necessary. Everyone else rushed through it like a tunnel underwater. Even the head physician on call, Doc Brustwood, a calm, clinical man with 2 decades in trauma, avoided looking down certain hallways, especially the hallway that led to what they called the quiet room. The quiet room is where they take families when there's bad news. It's tucked just off the trauma bay, through a narrow side door with no window. It has one lamp, a worn couch, and a wooden crucifix that tilts a little to the left, no matter how many times you straighten it. I remember running my fingers along its edge when I first stepped in that night, and feeling not comfort, not peace, but a kind of low-grade nausea, like the air had weight. They say the quiet room used to be an old supply closet, that it was converted after a particularly bad mass casualty in '92, but I don't think it was ever meant to be anything holy. There's something about it, the way it hums when it's empty, the way the walls feel just a little too close, and how, despite being windowless, there's always a breeze, cold and damp, that touches the back of your neck when you're alone in there. Jasmine told me not to sit in there too long. That night, I should have listened, but I was still trying to do things the right way. Be present, be available, stay close to the grief. That's what chaplains do. We enter the pain, even if something else is already inside. The first call came in just before midnight. Motorcycle accident, male, late 30s, unresponsive on arrival. I was already at the nurse's station, thumbing through my notepad, trying to calm my nerves, when the intercom cracked and buzzed overhead. Chaplain needed Bay 2. Simple, direct, but the voice that said it, flat, hollow, completely devoid of inflection, wasn't familiar. I looked up. No one else seemed to have heard it. Jasmine glanced at me confused and said, We don't page chaplains through the intercom. But there it was, clear as anything, still ringing in my ears. Bay 2. I didn't argue. I just went. The trauma bay was already in motion. Dr. Westwood stood over the patient, barking out vitals, his voice a low thunder under the fluorescent hum. The man on the gurney looked young, but his face was ruined. Helmet had come off, eyes still fluttering, chest working shallowly against the oxygen mask. And behind him, just behind the curtain's edge, was a shadow that didn't match anything in the room. It was tall, still, and didn't move when the nurses did. I thought it was just a coat rack or a trick of the light, but I remember the moment I stepped fully into Bay 2. That room went cold. I mean instantaneously. My breath fogged, the skin on my arms prickled, and when I glanced up at the air vent, I noticed something odd. The slats were sealed shut with tape. No airflow, no reason for the temperature to drop. Yet the monitor next to the patient began to glitch. Just little stutters at first, minor interruptions in the rhythm. Jasmine leaned in to adjust it, muttered something about cheap wiring, and I tried to focus on the man in front of me. His eyes opened, glassy, rolling. He looked past me, not at me, but behind me. And then he whispered it. Don't let her in. Not a plea, not a question. A warning. Dr. Westwood didn't hear. He was too busy checking for internal bleeding. But I saw Jasmine freeze, her hand still on the IV line, and slowly look at me. She didn't ask what he'd said. She didn't need to. She just whispered, "He's not the first one." I wanted to ask what she meant. I should have asked. But then the monitor flatlined for a full 3 seconds and came back. No CPR, no paddles, nothing. It just stopped and started again perfectly, like someone had turned it off and then flipped the switch back on. Dr. Westwood cursed, said it must be a loose lead, and barked for a replacement monitor. I stood there trying to ignore the fact that I could see my own breath in a room that had no reason to be cold, trying not to turn around, because I was starting to realize something else had entered with us, something that didn't like being seen. The rest of that night moved in slow, syrupy stretches of time. The patient was stabilized and wheeled off to imaging. Westwood moved on like nothing had happened, clinical, brisk, already burying the moment in muscle memory. But Jasmine, she lingered. After everyone else cleared the room, she tugged gently on my sleeve and nodded toward the hallway. We stepped into the corridor outside Bay 2, beneath one of those flickering lights that seemed to always be just on the verge of going out. "Listen," she said low. "There's stuff here. Stuff people don't talk about. That room, Bay 2, no one wants to be assigned there after midnight. It's not official, but we trade off. We rotate. We pretend it's nothing." I asked her why. She looked at me, tired, frightened, like someone who'd already said too much, and just shook her head. "People crash in there, even stable ones. Machines glitch. Families say weird things, like they saw someone else in the room, standing in the corner, watching. Sometimes a woman, sometimes just a shadow. I didn't know what to do with that. I'm trained to handle grief, trauma, loss, not that." I nodded, thanked her, and told her I'd pray. But the words felt thin in my mouth. I needed to understand more. I needed to know. So the next morning, I stayed after my shift. I told the day chaplain I'd hang around, familiarize myself with the building. Instead, I went looking. Down in the basement archives, just past the old radiology filing cabinets, was a neglected room, full of dust-caked folders and medical records no one had digitized. I shouldn't have had access, but my badge worked. I still don't know if it was a glitch or an invitation. I pulled the files for trauma room assignments, focusing on Day 2. The paper trail wasn't organized well. Old handwritten logs, yellowed shift reports, but I saw patterns, weird ones, names showing up over and over, incidents that never made it into digital records. 3 codes in 1 month. All cardiac arrests in Bay 2. All patients who had been improving before the crash. 2 family members reported seeing a woman in white, standing behind the doctors. One visitor claimed they saw the crucifix on the quiet room wall turn itself around. I started writing things down, making notes, piecing timelines, and that's when I found it. A folded paper tucked between the logs from neck. It was a handwritten note, torn at the edges, old but carefully folded. It read, "She follows the guilt. She only comes when there's pain." And below that, in smaller print, Room 207 was sealed for a reason. We moved the trauma bay, but she didn't stay behind. There was no signature, no date, just those words, heavy, deliberate. Room 207. I had never seen it, but I was starting to realize it had seen me. I couldn't get it out of my head. The hospital floor maps didn't show it, not in the current schematics anyway. The trauma bays were renumbered, rerouted after a renovation in the early 2000s, and records before that were sparse. But I found an old laminated floor plan tacked inside a dusty janitor's closet near the sub-level break room, and there it was, just off the original trauma corridor, where the hallway now ends abruptly behind a sealed fire door. Room 207. It had been real one. I went to the door that should have led to it. It was painted shut, the kind of shut that takes intention, layers of paint, bolts with no external heads, a deliberate erasure, but you could still feel the air around it. Stillness, but not peace. Cold again, not breeze cold, not vent cold. It was the kind of cold that felt aware of you. I reached out, hesitated, and laid my palm flat against the metal. Immediately, a sharp pain cut across my temple like an ice pick through memory, and for a split second I saw something, a flash, a gurney, an overhead light swinging wildly, and someone standing in the far corner of a room, face hidden by shadows, head tilted just slightly too far to the left. I yanked my hand back. The pain stopped. I should have walked away. Any sane person would have. But I could. That night, back in my apartment, I kept seeing that flash over and over again when I closed my eyes. So I did what I shouldn't have. I asked Jasmine. We were sitting on the back steps during her break, the dull orange of the parking lot lights flickering against her scrubs. When I mentioned 207, "You're not supposed to know about that," she said. I told her about the note, about the pain, the memory. She stayed quiet for a long moment, then finally said, "I used to work peds." One of the old nurses told me stories back when that wing was still active. There was a chaplain who used to cover nights, Reverend Mathis. Sweet old guy, real gentle, always humming hymns. I nodded slowly. I had heard that name once during orientation. He wasn't on staff anymore. He hung himself, she said quietly. In room 23, after a patient coded, they said he'd been talking to himself for weeks, saying he was seeing something in the reflection glass, not in the room, behind it. I felt sick. The pieces were starting to slide together. She added one more thing. The family of that patient. They filed a complaint, said Reverend Mathis was acting strange, kept asking them if they saw a woman standing behind the bed. Said he wouldn't stop staring into the corner of the room. I asked her what happened to the room after that. She shook her head. Sealed quietly. They moved everything out. Renumbered, pretended it never existed. But it had, and whatever had been there, whoever had been there, wasn't gone. Just waiting. For a few days after that conversation with Jasmine, I convinced myself that I was just tired, that all of it, the cold, the voices, the flashes of something not quite seen, could be explained by exhaustion, grief saturation, maybe even stress hallucinations. I even made an appointment with the hospital counselor under the guise of self-care. Told her I'd been having strange dreams, trouble sleeping, nothing serious. She nodded, scribbled something on her clipboard, and gave me a brochure about burnout. I should have felt relieved. I should have let that be the end of it. But then I met Thomas Ivert. He was a night shift custodian, been with St. Luke's for over 20 years. always kept to himself. Our paths crossed when I took the wrong elevator, trying to reach the chapel, and ended up 2 levels deeper than I should have. The lower sublevels weren't used anymore, except for old storage and mechanical maintenance. That's where I found him, pushing a mop down a hallway that looked untouched by renovation or time. He was humming something under his breath. It was out of tune and familiar. I introduced myself, explained the elevator mix-up. He gave me a sideways look and just said, "You're the new chaplain, the one who pokes around." I hesitated. "I'm just curious." He chuckled, dry, bitter. "That's how it starts, with curiosity. Then the dreams come. Then the cold, then the shadows start talking." My blood turned to ice. I asked him about room 20 Therin. He didn't blink. Room 20 Therin venom, electrical fire. Years ago. That's what the records say. A fire. That wasn't in anything I'd read. No mention of damage. No scorched walls. No renovation permits filed under that wing. I asked him when it happened. 96 or 97. I forget, he said, suddenly cagey. Doesn't matter now. Room's gone. Doesn't exist. But something about the way he said it didn't sit right. Too rehearsed. Too convenient. So I went to the facilities office and requested maintenance logs for that wing. For those years, the clerk gave me a tired look and told me the files had all been transferred off-site during a records consolidation. It felt like a dead end. A fire, with no record. A room, erased. A janitor who spoke like he was reciting lines. For a day or two, I let myself believe it. Maybe it really had all burned away. Maybe I was chasing ghosts that had already been reduced to ash. But that night, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to hum the same melody Thomas Ivers had been humming, coming from inside my apartment. And when I turned on the light, the room was empty, but the crucifix above my bed was turned completely upside down. The crucifix should have been secure. I'd mounted it myself. Solid brass, anchored into the drywall with care. It had hung above my bed since the day I moved in. It never tilted, never wobbled. But that night, after the humming, it was upside down, perfectly straight, perfectly inverted. I sat there in the dark for a long time, watching it, trying to rationalize, trying to breathe. In the morning, I returned to the hospital with a single purpose. I needed more than rumors and flashes of something wrong. I needed proof, and proof, I figured, lived in the personnel record. I pulled some strings, played the pastoral care card, got a brief appointment with HR under the guise of archival inquiry for a memorial service. I asked about Reverend Mathis. The clerk, a thin, expressionless man named Dennis, pulled up a file. It was thin, too thin. One printed page. Chaplain Elijah Mathis, employed from 1988 to 1999, resigned due to health concerns. No disciplinary actions noted. I blinked. Resigned. Dennis nodded, tapping the paper. That's what it says. No incident, no mention of a suicide. I asked to see his physical file. Dennis looked uneasy, said those were in the restricted archives. Hospital policy. But I noticed something strange. On the digital copy, the emergency contact field was redacted. Unusual, unless there was a confidentiality flag or a cover-up. I pressed. Eventually Dennis relented. Look, I shouldn't even say this, but there was an old folder once. Handwritten notes, counseling memos. One entry talked about delusions, a breakdown, but it disappeared years ago, after the remodel. Who removed it? He shrugged. I don't know, but the name that kept showing up on the entries wasn't Mathis. He scribbled it down on a scrap of paper and slid it across the desk. Success Thorne. The name meant nothing to me. But when I got back to the basement records later that day, I found it again hidden in the margins of an incident log from 1997. Not a chaplain, not a nurse. Listed under a department I didn't recognize. Patient liaison, special containment. There is no department like that at St. Luke's. I asked Jasmine about it. She went pale and said, That's not real, we don't have anything called that. But I kept digging, through crumbling memos, half-erased whiteboard notes, archived emails, and I found something chilling. One of the internal memos, badly faded but still legible, was marked urgent, dated August 19, 1999. S.K. Thorne advises room 2037 be sealed indefinitely. Containment integrity compromised following authorized sacramental visitation. All further entries require administrative override and level 3 spiritual clearance. What the hell was spiritual clearance? And why would a hospital ever need a containment protocol for a room? I sat there in that basement, surrounded by mildew and forgotten files, and realized this wasn't just a room with bad history. Room 2037 wasn't haunted. It had been contained, and something or someone had let it loose again. It happened during a night shift, almost exactly 1 year to the day after Reverend Mathis's reported resignation. A young man was brought into Bay 2 after a car crash, conscious, though barely, multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding, but stable for the moment. I was called down as usual to sit with the family, his mother mostly, a small quiet woman who gripped a crucifix so tightly I could see the imprint in her palm. She kept whispering, "He's seeing her. He keeps saying he sees her." At first I thought she meant a vision, a loved one perhaps, as some do in trauma. But then the boy, his name was Marcus, began to speak between shallow breaths. "She's in the mirror," he gasped. "She was behind the doctor. She doesn't blink. She's watching." I followed his gaze to the observation window across the room, the one we used to discreetly monitor patients from the hall. There was no one there, and yet there was a faint outline, like frost blooming slowly from the center. Not from the air conditioning. It was warm in there. The rest of the glass was clear, but in the center, right at eye level, a pattern began to form. Circular, distorted, like fingers pressing from the other side. I stepped out into the hallway, just to prove to myself it was nothing, that it wasn't real. But as I approached the glass, my reflection didn't match. I swear to you I didn't move, but the figure in the glass turned its head ever so slightly to look at me. It was me, but it wasn't. It was pale as if drained, eyes too wide, the mouth just a little too far open, like it was screaming without sound. And behind it, behind the reflection of myself, was her, a woman, thin, dressed in what looked like a patient's gown, skin like old wax, sagging as if half melted, long black hair hanging in wet strands around a face I could barely make out. She didn't move, she didn't blink, she just stood there, watching, and then she smiled. Only the reflection smiled, not me. I stumbled back, nearly fell into a crash cart. Jasmine caught me as I grabbed the wall, breath ragged, skin cold. She didn't even ask, just looked at me and whispered, "You saw her too." That was the moment I knew. All of it. The sealed records, the falsified resignation, the containment memos, the crucifix turning in my sleep. It wasn't just haunting. It wasn't a ghost. It was a presence, and it was feeding off us, off our grief, our pain, our guilt, and someone, so maybe even the hospital itself, had tried to bind it. They hadn't succeeded. They'd only buried it. And now, it had begun to follow us back out. After I saw her, really saw her, something shifted. I could feel it, not just in the hospital, but in myself, like I'd crossed some threshold I couldn't retreat from. The air felt heavier around me, thick like fog in the lungs. Lights flickered more frequently when I entered rooms. Machines stuttered, and people started looking at me differently. Nurses would go silent when I passed. Westwood stopped acknowledging me altogether. Even Jasmine began avoiding eye contact. It was as if, by witnessing her, I'd become marked. Then came the night the quiet room locked itself from the inside. A family had just received word that their son had passed in surgery. I led them into the quiet room. A father, a sister and the boy's fiancé. I stayed with them for a while, offered quiet words, held space as they cried. When they were ready to leave, I reached for the handle and it wouldn't turn. No click, no give, just resist it. I checked the lock. It wasn't engaged. There was no keyhole on the inside. Jasmine knocked from the other side a few minutes later, trying to open it from the hall. Nothing. Dead sealed. We called maintenance. 15 minutes later, they arrived with a key, but even with the master, the door refused to budge, and then the temperature dropped. The fiancée gasped. "Why is it so cold in here?" she asked, shivering as her breath came out in mist. I looked toward the corner of the room, that corner, and there she was, not in the reflection this time, not a glimpse. She was standing, no, looming in the corner, spine bent at an unnatural angle, her head twitching in these small sudden jerks, like something in her had broken and never reset right. Her eyes were two pits of night. Her mouth hung open, not screaming, not breathing, just a sound low, guttural, wet began to crawl out from deep within her chest. The father stood up, backing into the wall. Who the hell? But before he could finish, the crucifix on the wall snapped. It didn't fall, it exploded. Splinters of wood scattered across the room. The light bulb in the standing lamp burst with a pop, plunging everything into this trembling blue-black dark. And then came the whisper. It didn't come from her lips. It came from everywhere. "You see me now." The door opened. Just like that. No key, no force. It simply let go. The others fled. Jasmine pulled them down the hallway. I stayed. For a few seconds longer I stayed. Because I had to know. Because I couldn't run. Not yet. And she stepped forward. But only one step. That's when I realized she couldn't leave the quiet room. She was tethered, bound. Somehow. Something about that space held her, but only just. And it was weakening. I left that night, knowing something had changed forever. That she had let me see her. Chosen to. And I still had one part left to play. Not just as a chaplain, but as her final witness. I didn't sleep the next night. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the silence, and tried to pray. But the words came out hollow, like they were being swallowed by something just out of reach. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her in that corner, unmoving, patient, waiting. That morning I went back to the basement. This time I wasn't looking for more records. I brought oil, salt, my grandfather's rosary, and something Reverend Mathis had once written in the back of an old hymnal I found tucked behind a loose ceiling tile. She binds herself to the sin that goes unspoken. Only confession breaks her grip. Only truth sets the room free. It made sense now. The guilt, the pain, the way the air changed when families lied to themselves or refused to speak what they already knew. She fed on it, drew strength from silence, denial, and the hospital, God help them, had been starving her with secrecy for decades. I called Jasmine, told her I needed help getting back into the quiet room. No more hiding. She met me there after hours. No lights, no cameras, just the two of us, and the dim pulse of fluorescent hum. She didn't ask what we were doing. She knew. I think part of her had always known. We stepped into the quiet room together. The door clicked shut behind us without either of us touching it. This time we didn't wait. I stepped into the center, poured a ring of salt, and placed the rosary in the center. I spoke not in Latin, not in scripture. I just spoke. I confessed. I told her about my brother, about how I hadn't picked up his call that night, about the guilt that had followed me into ministry. I told her about the fear I carried into every room, about the cracks in my faith, and the temperature dropped. The air went still. Jasmine's breath caught. Her eyes were fixed on the corner again, but not at her, at him, Reverend Mathis. He stood just beside her, translucent and broken, lips moving but no sound escaping. His eyes were full of pain. He wasn't here to hurt us. He was still trapped, a man who had tried to stop it and failed, and now watched us. hoping someone would finish what he couldn't. I turned back to her. She stepped forward, but this time, I didn't move. I faced her, and I said the name out loud, S.K. Thorne. That stopped her. Her head snapped toward me, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. Her mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and then from behind her, another figure stepped forward. Thorne, smiling, not a ghost, a man, or what was left of one. His eyes burned with something that wasn't human. And then I understood. He hadn't tried to bind her. He had offered her the room. He fed her the dying, the grieving, the guilty, to keep her here, to hold power in silence, in pain. And now, I was breaking that cycle. I stepped into the salt ring, held the rosary high, and spoke the one thing they had never let into that room. You are seen, you are remembered, and your suffering is over. The room exploded in sound, screams, static, 1,000 voices crying out at once, and then silent, total suffocating silence. The light above us flickered one last time, and then stayed on. The crucifix on the wall straightened itself, and she was gone. Thorne, too. Mathis simply nodded and vanished. The room hasn't locked since, but every now and then I feel the air shift. Not cold, not violent, just aware. I think we ended something, but I don't know what we started.